I don't think I've been generally so excited for a product. So cine lenses are great, I really like using them, but they do have one inherent flaw, which is that most of them are manual focus. Now you can either learn to pull focus yourself, which is definitely a skill that you need to learn, and it is a little bit harder if you're trying to track moving subjects or fast subjects, or you can either get a first AC to pull focus for you, which isn't always so practical. But finally, we have a solution to that, which is the Tilta Autofocus adapter. So I've been using this for about the past 2 months. I really wanted to put it through its paces to test it out. I've been shooting bikes, cars, doing talking head videos with it, shooting B-roll, and I think I have enough experience with it to give you my thoughts. So this isn't the first device that gives cine lenses autofocus. There has been a DJI LiDAR, which I actually made a video about in the past, that also gives cine lenses autofocus, but it is a little bit of a different system. So for the DJI LiDAR, you actually need to mount an actual LiDAR onto the camera, and that has some flaws that are really annoying to work around. So basically a LiDAR, it sends out a little laser that tells the distance of where you're trying to focus on, and it relays that information to motors, which will then turn your cine lens for you. But the flaw is that because it is a separate unit that's telling the motors how much to focus, the field of view actually isn't the same. So if you mount it really close to the lens, probably around here, then you might get a very similar field of view. But if you have a really wide lens or a super zoomed in lens, then what the LiDAR is seeing is going to be completely different from what the camera is seeing, and that's going to throw off the focusing a little bit. The LiDAR is also a separate unit that you have to attach onto your camera. But right now, if you come in close, we have a peel adapter here. So peel adapters are really great because it's actually pretty much what everyone uses to mount cine lenses. These are really great because they are pretty universal. Now, right now, this is only made for Sony E-mount, but hopefully they come up with other ones for other brands later. But essentially, a peel mount is usually just a chunk of metal that holds the lens. But basically for this peel adapter, you actually have contact pins. You do have some peel lenses that do something different. So for example, this one, it has a filter built in, but usually there's no electronic to it. It literally is just a chunk of metal. So the camera will actually use its own focusing system to relay that information to the peel adapter, and then the peel adapter will tell the motors how much to move. That means that because the camera is using its own sensor, there's no discrepancies with what the camera is seeing and what a separate unit would be seeing. Basically, what the camera sees is what you can control focus for. It also means that you can control other things like autofocus speed, you can do eye tracking, you can do subject tracking, you can also change things like aperture, which I'll talk about in a second. So what you're seeing right now is a real-time breakdown of the autofocus adapter working. So you can see that I'm moving back and forth, and the motor is also moving the lens to be able to focus on me while I'm moving back and forth. So you can see that if I move in, it's going to move the motors, and if I move back out, it's going to move as well. You'll see the calibration process in a second, but basically what I have to do is I have to basically map out every single focus point on the lens, on the markings on the side, to be able to tell the autofocus adapter where these certain distances. So for example, let's say I'm about 4 feet away. The camera will see that I'm 4 feet away. It'll send the signal into the adapter and tell the adapter that I'm 4 feet away. And then it'll send that signal to the motor. And then the motor will turn the lens so that it focuses on a distance of 4 meters away. Again, I'll show you the calibration process in a second, and this will all make sense. So the DJI LiDAR setup is actually pretty annoying. So when you mount the LiDAR onto the camera, you actually have a separate side handle. That's actually what powers the motors and the LiDAR. The side handle is pretty big, and that was one of my biggest gripes with it, is that you're adding a huge unnecessary battery onto your rig when you don't need to. Because the LiDAR needs to relay that information to the motors and also control how much the cine lens will focus, you actually need to know the distance between the front of the LiDAR to the sensor of the camera, which means that when you're actually setting it up, you have to have a ruler or some kind of measuring unit to measure that distance. And if you don't have it, or if you happen to change the position of your LiDAR, then you're shit out of luck. To calibrate it, you basically need to set 2 control points. So you can stand 0.5 to 1.5 meters away from your subject, manually focus on it, and then that's your first calibration point. And then you can stand 4 to 5 meters away from your subject, set focus yourself, and then that's your second control point. Now that part for calibration is pretty simple, but obviously the more points that you have to calibrate, the more accurate it will be. Because the whole thing also relies on the LiDAR being able to see your subject, it means that you have to get pretty creative with how you mount the LiDAR. So I actually really like using a map box, but I had a hard time using a map box because the flag would keep blocking the front of the LiDAR. Now I've seen people do some really weird things where they mount the LiDAR under the lens, or they like 3D print some bracket to stick it right over the lens. But honestly, I feel like that's a pretty gimmicky way of doing it, and I feel like for a unit that's pretty expensive, you shouldn't really need to have to jump through all those loopholes just to get it to work. So with this peel adapter, because of any normal cine lens, I would already have it. So it's not adding on any extra bulk or any extra units that I wouldn't normally use. On this side over here, you have a USB-C cable. This just runs into a dual USB-C cable, and those connect to the two motors right up here. And on this side, it literally is just the cable that you need to run into power. So right now this is connected to my V-mount. If I plug that in there, you can see everything here powers on. And basically this one USB-C cable powers everything here, the peel adapter and the motors, and you don't need a separate side handle or another big unit to power everything. So when you power it on, you have a little screen here and you can actually change all the settings. And you also have this little knob right here. This is where you can just interface with the menu. Once you plug it in and when you start to set it up, you basically just have to tell the adapter which side of the camera the motors are on. So right now, these two motors are on the right side of the camera, and I just have to put that into the menu there. Okay, so to quickly show you how the calibration process works, we're just gonna hit menu, we're going to go to add a lens, and I'm gonna just enter the brand name and the model name. So this is the Blazer Remus anamorphic lens. I'm just gonna add that in really quick. Then it's going to ask you for circle of confusion, COC. I don't exactly know what this does, but I believe 0.035 or 0.025 should be the right COC to use for my camera, which is the Sony FX3. If you are using a different camera, I would just do a quick search, but I'm pretty sure I'm gonna set mine to 0.025 and it should be okay. And then this is an anamorphic lens, so I'm just gonna set it to 1.5 because this is a 1.5 times squeeze. If you're not using an anamorphic lens, you can just set it to 1.0. So for the unit, I'm actually going to turn it to metric just because the markings on this lens right here uses meters. And then focal length, I'm just going to put it to 33 millimeters. This is the 33 millimeter Blazer Remus. So this would just save your lens profile basically. So right now it's going to ask me to map focus. So right now it says infinity. So I'm just going to pick up the lens, and on the side here, I'm just going to turn it so that it's at infinity. And then here you're basically just going to press enter on it. And then it's going to ask me to go to my minimum focus distance. So right now this is 0.49 meters. So on the screen here, I'm just going to turn this so that it's 0.49. You press enter. And then basically all of these markings here on the side, you want to go through every single one and map all of them. So I'm going to go to 0.55. And then here I'm going to change this to 0.55. Basically you want to map out every single one. Now when you move this focus ring, because the motor is moving, you should see the screen or the line on the screen here also move. If you don't see it moving, it probably means that your motor has not been updated to the proper firmware to be able to work with the system. So I would just check the motor update firmware. So 0.8, you're basically just going to go through every single one. Now I get that this can be a little bit tedious, but like I mentioned, the more points you have to calibrate it, the better it will be and the more accurate it will be. And that's basically how the system works. When these camera sends a signal to the adapter, it tells the adapter what distance it is. And then because you're mapping out every single focus point or the distance on the adapter and the follow focus motors knows exactly how much to turn to get to that specific distance. And then when you're done here, you just click next. And then now it's going to tell you to map your iris. So same thing, you're going to go to the widest aperture that you can do. So right now, this is a T1.8 lens. So I'm just going to switch it to T1.8. And then on the adapter, you're just going to set T1.8. And then you're just going to go through that for every single aperture. So T2, put T2 on the lens here. And then when you're done here, just click next. And then it'll ask you to confirm. Once you confirm, that's all the calibration is done. So now whenever you want to just switch lens profiles, you just click on the menu, you go to lens list. So here I'm just going to go to Blazer, and then you can see my Remus 33mm that I just entered here. I'm just going to click on it, use data, and then now you can see Blazer Remus 33mm, that's my lens profile for this lens. And then that's all the calibration. Now, again, like I mentioned, the first time is a little bit more tedious, but once you do it, you never have to deal with it again. You literally just put the lens in, the motors will calibrate to make sure that they have the right start and end point, and then you just change the lens profile on the adapter. Very simple. So obviously that does take a little bit more time to calibrate, but as I said, the more calibration points you have, the more accurate it will be. So I actually really like this system. And once you do it once, you never have to change it again. You don't have to worry about anything else screwing up the calibration. So unlike the LiDAR, where the distance of the LiDAR has to be the same unless you have some measuring device to recalibrate that distance, as soon as you calibrate it once here, every time you use the same lens, it will be perfect. So I mentioned that there are two motors. Obviously you have the focus motor, which is going to control your focusing, and then you have your aperture motor. So what the cool thing is that because the camera is sending a signal to the adapter and relaying all its information, you can actually change the aperture from the camera itself. So basically right now it's at t2.1, and on the screen here it's also at f2.1, basically the same thing. But right now I can make it to f4, and you can see that the lens actually changes to T4, and I can do it to 5.6, I can do it to T8, go back to T2.1, because the camera is relaying its information to the motor. And because we calibrated every single aperture point here, the autofocus adapter knows exactly how much to turn the motor to get to each point, which is really cool. And it's not really something that you can do otherwise without some kind of motor. So sometimes there might be times where you don't want to use autofocus, and sometimes you want to switch back to manual focus. So with the Tilta Nucleus follow focus wheel, you can actually hold on to the FN button or the function button, and that will override the motors, and then you can actually use that follow focus wheel to turn and control your focus yourself. That one does have a weird quirk though, which I'll mention later. So none of these cool features actually matter if this doesn't work well. So how well does it actually work? So I'll let these clips play on a little longer than I normally would, just so that you can actually see the transitions when I'm moving between different shots and how the autofocus adapter reacts at different scenarios. So when we're shooting cars and bikes, it was actually really good. I just set the focus mode to zone, the biggest zone possible, and I just basically set it in the center, and it had no problems tracking bikes or cars. Now this camera, the FX3, doesn't have subject detection or car detection, so even though it doesn't have that, it still worked pretty well. I assume if you're on something like the Sony a7 IV, which does have subject detection, it would probably work even better, but for the FX3, we had no problems with that. There was a weird quirk when we were shooting a GMC ad. For some reason, whenever the GMC had the headlights on, the autofocus adapter couldn't really focus on it. I don't know if that would normally happen with a native Sony lens and if that was the camera's fault or the autofocus adapter's fault, but that was just something that I noticed. So for the car rig, we basically had it on a Tilta Hydra Alien, and we basically had this exact setup. So right now, if I take off the top handle, we basically just had the motors mounted this way. So it was just mounted onto the top of the cage, one rod that feeds into two motors, and those will be controlling the lens itself. This USB-C cable, we just had it mounted onto the car rig so that it was hooked up to the power supply or the V-mount that was already there. And we basically just took off this whole base, and it basically makes this car rig very small because you literally just need to attach this part onto it and it powers everything. Now we were able to monitor everything using the Hollyland Pyro system. So we had a transmission system linked up to this so that I could see exactly how well the focusing is doing. I could also obviously control the gimbal to make sure that the camera is pointed the right way. I also used the Sony Monitor and Control app to be able to change the settings of the camera. And because we can actually change the aperture from the camera, I can actually use the Monitor and Control app to control the exposure of the camera itself. So sometimes, especially when you're on a car rig, it's a lot harder to reach while you're moving, and normally we just have to set an exposure and hope that nothing really changes too much. But because we can control the aperture from the camera, I can use my phone to adjust the exposure whenever we're going into super dark or super bright situations, and be able to adjust everything so that we will be able to continue rolling without having to stop just to change the exposure. So when we were shooting B-roll, it was actually really good as well. Now, I did find that the autofocus adapter had a bit of trouble whenever we were shooting really close to a subject at a really shallow depth of field. So these clips right here, I was shooting with a Nisi 50mm t1.9, and obviously at t1.9, when you're that close, your depth of field is going to be super shallow. So you can see that the autofocus adapter has a little bit of problems focusing on it, but I think that because it is such a shallow depth of field, even with a native Sony lens, you're still going to have that problem, which is why a lot of the times I do like to use manual focus. So I wouldn't really chalk that up to the autofocus adapter not working as well. I think that it is just a limitation of autofocus, and which is why a lot of people still like to use manual focus. For talking head shots, I had no problems with the autofocus adapter as well because the camera can do eye tracking and it can relay that information to the lens itself. So that was not a problem. If I was trying to do product shots and just holding a product up to the camera, I had the same problem as before where if the depth of field is too shallow, the autofocus would be a little bit hit or miss because the depth of field is so shallow. So again, I would just chalk that up to autofocus not being as good, and which is why I like to use manual focus. So I've been really enjoying this adapter, but obviously every product has some downsides. So the first downside that I noticed is that it's actually really loud.
Go ahead and install it. We'll do the middle one first.
Depending on the distance that the camera is trying to focus on, if it's a very drastic difference, the motors are really fast, so that's great. The autofocus is fast, but it actually turns it really fast and it's super loud. So if you are running a mic and you're trying to shoot something that requires good audio, I would be a little bit wary about how loud these motors are. A second downside is the placement of these cables. So obviously the autofocus adapter has to have cables running into it to be able to power it. So this left side is usually not a problem. I can put my hand here and it doesn't really interfere with this too much. I normally have a side handle on this side anyways, so this cable is not a problem. But for this side, this is the one that powers the autofocus adapter, and you can see that when I put my hand onto the actual grip of the camera, my fingers kind of run into it. And I'm kind of worried that if I push too hard by accident, I'll snap the USB-C, and it just makes it a little bit harder to hold here. Now for the DJI LiDAR, you have a mode called AMF mode, which is automated manual focus, which means that whenever the motors are moving and it's trying to focus on your subject, the dial on the side handle will actually move as well in accordance to how much the motor is moving. And if you ever want to switch to manual mode, you can literally just grab onto that dial and it'll stop the motors, and then you can turn that dial and be able to switch into manual focus right away and control it. With the autofocus adapter, you kind of can do the same thing. Obviously, the follow focus wheel doesn't have a motor inside, so that follow focus wheel isn't going to move, which isn't a problem. So normally if I'm in autofocus mode and I want to kick into manual focus, ideally I would be able to press the function button and turn it, and it would start off from exactly where it was at before I switched it to manual focus. That way I could seamlessly switch to manual focus, pick off right where the autofocus is at off, and just kind of fine tune the autofocus a little bit. But as you can see, this is that weird quirk. So right now I'm not pressing the manual focus button, so right now the focus is at 38. As soon as I press it, you can see the motor spin up. And if I let go, it'll jump back right to where it was before. Which means that if I'm using autofocus and I want to just fine tune the controls, I can't just press it and slowly make small adjustments, because as soon as I press it, it's going to jump instantly and it's going to mess up the focus. Because ideally I would be able to hold on to it and just turn, and let's say the autofocus stopped here and I just want to fine tune it, I can just kind of turn it wherever I want. But as soon as I press that button, it's going to spin the focus motors. So that's really annoying. Now this should be a really easy fix, so I hope that it is something that will be fixed eventually in the future with a firmware update. So how much does this unit actually cost? If you're trying to get just the PL adapter, that comes in at 300 USD, at least at time of recording. And if you want to get the full kit, which basically comes with the autofocus adapter and 2 motors, that will be 500 USD. And honestly, that's pretty much like half the price of the DJI LiDAR. So I think that's kind of a no-brainer on why you want to pick this up instead of that. So you've been thinking about getting a cine lens and you've been worried about trying to manual focus it. I do recommend the Tilta Autofocus adapter. I actually think that's really good. It hasn't left my camera ever since I got it. Now again, I do like using manual focus. I've been using it enough that I can manual focus everything pretty much perfectly by myself, but it does save a lot of time if I'm ever shooting events or just something where I'm a little bit too lazy to manual focus everything. It has come in handy, and that also allows us to be able to use cine lenses when we're doing car shoots. If you have any questions, let me know down in the comments below. If you like this video, remember to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to see more photo video content, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.